Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Conroy with the National Sports Media Association. Today, I'm here with 2022 North Carolina Sportswriter of the Year, Andrew Carter. Andrew, thank you for being with us today.
Ben, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So, my first question, I'll just start from the beginning. I was wondering if you could take me through a little bit about your career path, maybe your first job, and your road to where you are now with the News and Observer.
So my first job, I guess, would have been with the Rocky Mount Telegram in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. That's kind of a small, I don't know, basically rest stop town. I went from there to the Orlando Sentinel. I covered Florida State. I covered high schools, and I've been with the NNO for the past 11 years or so.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on a very storied career to this point. I wanted to ask if you had some advice for a young person or a college student who is looking for that first job right out of college in the world of sports media or looking to crack their way into that industry, what sort of advice would you have?
Oh, golly. I get this question a lot, and I feel like, I think it's changed so much since I got into it. If I were telling a young person, and there's a joke of don't do it a little bit, but it's kind of, I would say diversify yourself as much as you can. I would say get as much multimedia experience. I would say, there's no such thing nowadays, I think, of a person who just kind of, only does one thing. I mean, I came up, I kind of gave you the quick abridged version, but I wanted to write. That was kind of, my goal. I grew up reading, Sports Illustrated when I was a kid. I was big into, Gary Smith and Rick Riley and kind of, those famous guys in the 80s and early 90s who wrote for SI. And that's what I wanted to do. I grew up reading the NNO. Carlton Tudor, who I'm honored to kind of be in his company as a recipient of this honor. He won it a few times. It has a long storied history of people who've done really well and, great sports journalists and reporters and writers. And, I wanted to write again. That was kind of my motivation and my inspiration. And I wanted to write those big takeouts that Gary Smith would do in the SI back in the day. And I'm not really sure that path exists anymore. I mean, certainly there are great writers who, achieve a lot of high level success, and Sports Illustrated is not what it was, but it's still, it's good. They have several good people there. There's plenty of good people at the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera. But I struggle with this in my own career about what the path is. So when I'm trying to give folks advice, especially younger people, I say be as versatile as you can, branch out in different forms of media. Podcasts are big. Obviously, I think that's a skill that's worth developing in terms of doing stuff from an audio point of view. Video obviously is not going anywhere. So having as much of a multimedia background and skill set, I think, is going to help folks. And then, be really flexible about where you're willing to go, what kind of jobs you're willing to take, especially starting out. Going back to the start of my career, it was this 10, 15,000. Well, I guess that sounds sort of decent now, but back then it wasn't. 10, 15,000 circulation paper kind of in the middle of nowhere. And I think a lot of times younger folks nowadays might get scared away of starting small, or maybe thinking like if you go somewhere, you're going to get stuck or never get out. You can always pivot or decide it's not for you or whatever. But especially starting out, I would say be flexible. Don't be afraid to start small or wherever and gain experience. Those are some of my general thoughts, but it's changed so much because what the industry looks like now in 2023, I don't think anyone expected it to look like this even maybe 5 years ago, or certainly not 10 or 15 or 20 when I started out. So, embrace the constant change of it. And I made that joke of, I hope people realize I was being lighthearted about don't do it. But if you are going to do it, make sure you're passionate about it and in it for the right reasons. I think you really have to care about the work, whether you're writing, whether you're on the video or, podcasting side of things. I think you really have to be passionate about what you're doing And especially if you're going to be kind of more of a writer, traditional journalist, I think you have to be really passionate about the reporting, and pursuing, high level work and stories and that side of things. Sometimes I think younger folks might want to get into it because they love sports, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think everyone who is in this profession at one point really was a big sports fan. But eventually, that's gonna fade over time. You're gonna peek behind the curtain and maybe learn some things that you didn't know or whatever. So you really have to be passionate about the work, I would say, is the main thing.
Absolutely. Certainly good advice there. You mentioned earlier that you've been with the News and Observer for 11 years. Obviously, that's a long time to stay in one place. So what are some of your favorite things about writing for the News and Observer and covering sports in North Carolina?
Yeah, so the NNO is really important to me on a personal level, just because I grew up in Raleigh. It was the paper I read throughout my childhood. I can name you folks who were, when I was a little kid. I actually went to career day in 8th grade at the NNO back in, I guess that was 1995. And I remember went there with a good friend of mine who I was in school with, and we both went to the NNO and got up to the second floor of the old offices and hung out with Carlton Tudor. And we were sitting in a chair next to him as he was, taking us through his column writing process. And we got a tour of the building and the printing press. They don't even print the paper now at the NNO anymore, and they've since long moved out of that particular building. But that was, such a neat moment for me as a kid. And reading folks like Tudor, like Chip Alexander. Chip still works there. He was my mentor in college, and helped get me my start back in the day. And it's neat that he's a colleague. But I think of guys like him and Gerald Martin, who was just an amazing writer. He covered auto racing and NASCAR. And I was not a racing fan, but Gerald was such a great writer that no matter what he read, you would want to read it. He was that talented. And, I could name names all day, the folks who were at the NNO back in the day. So it's such it's a special honor for me to be able to, work at a place that I grew up reading and admiring, and played such a big part of me wanting to be a journalist. And yeah, so I've been there for the past 11 years, coming up on 12 this year, and I covered UNC athletics for most of that time. For the first 7 years or so, I was the Tar Heels beat writer. So wherever they went in football and basketball, I went. Which made for some good trips at times. They went to Maui a couple times, when I was covering basketball, which was neat. And of course, it was a lot of late night drives back from Clemson or Blacksburg or places like that. But covering UNC was a great opportunity, and I really embraced it and loved it. Growing up in ACC country, if you will. I remember, my Saturdays as a kid was spent in front of pretty much in front of the TV all day long, watching those Raycom ACC basketball broadcasts. And, college basketball was such a huge part, still is, somewhat to a lesser degree, but it was such a huge part of, the culture of North Carolina, the sports history, and I embraced that and got sucked into it and really became passionate about college basketball. And so to have an opportunity to, to cover a UNC, cover the ACC for as long as I did. I covered Florida State before that with the Orlando Sentinel. So I covered, the ACC as a beat writer for more than a decade, which is a pretty good run. Some of the highlights during my tenure, back-to-back Final Fours in 16 and 17. Both of those were, special moments and memorable. And of course, it was a newsy beat, covering UNC when I did it. They were going through a prolonged NCAA investigation, with the academic, athletic issues that they had there for many years. And that was a learning experience. And, I got to do some investigative work and lots of stories that made people unhappy, but that's part of it. We cover reality and how things are. And sometimes that means writing stuff and reporting stuff that fans don't want you really to dig into. And people come up with misconceptions and this and that about, you have an agenda or you're biased or whatever. And, I will say that's another thing that's really changed about this whole thing since I've gotten into it. The whole social media aspect, fans taking shots at you and whatnot. And there's always been that to a degree, but I will say I think it's become a little bit worse over time, and it could kind of wear on you and beat you down a little bit. So I would add having thick skin to my list of advice. But getting back on track, at the NNO, after I stopped covering UNC, I've had the opportunity the past several years to, do some of those bigger stories, the kind of stuff that I grew up reading in a Sports Illustrated, things like that. I can spend time, reporting a longer feature. I can do some more investigative style work. Last March and early April, I was kind of put on the Coach K beat, if you will. So I was, pretty much sent around the country to follow Duke because Coach K was such a big story during that time, given the fact that it was his last NCAA tournament. And so that was just a huge deal. Like, when is he going to lose? When is it going to be his last game? That was kind of, my responsibility to kind of put that in perspective and context whenever it happened. And of course, along the way, it becomes this huge thing with, him getting closer and closer to the Final Four. And then obviously they got there and played Carolina and lost, and that was such a memorable event to cover. But there's a ton. I could talk all day just about some of the cool things I've gotten to witness, and some of the more powerfully somber things over the years too. Especially I kind of split time between sports and news. So I've covered hurricanes on the news side. I've covered tragic events, the mass shooting that we had in Raleigh. I was a part of our coverage of that. So it's been a neat opportunity for me to have a chance to branch out and do different things beyond the sports world too.
Absolutely. Definitely an eventful path there. So you just touched on some of the most impactful things you've gotten to cover up to this point. Is there anything you're working on right now or in the near future that you're excited to cover, excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for more ideas and kind of adding to my story list. It is, February as we record this, obviously Black History Month. And, before I hopped on here with you, Ben, I was just looking up the history of Hillside's basketball team of the mid-'60s called the Pony Express, one of the best high school basketball teams of all time. Story's been written occasionally here and there. ESPN actually did a mini documentary about it about 12 years ago or so. But Hillside, it was called Durham High back in the day, was the segregated high school in Durham. They set state records for points in a single game. Kind of brought in the idea of up and down basketball to high school basketball, and obviously that was adapted after that. So I'm kind of I'm digging into that story. There's a couple news stories I'm working on, one of which is about the Camp Lejeune toxic water situation. I've been hanging out with a former, well, there's no such thing as a former Marine. I've learned over the years writing about Marines, but I've been not chasing is the right word, but I've been hanging out and following a Marine who served at Lejeune back in the late 70s, who's sadly dealing with a lot of health issues. Certainly college basketball, we're about to get ramped up into that, heading into kind of the stretch run here. So there's some bigger stories I'll be doing with that. But kind of the neat thing for me now is I have an opportunity to kind of really dig into things and get to know sources and subjects. And I'm really lucky in that I can't say that I'm totally off the grind. Like, certainly there are times of the year where it's like it always has been for me. But I went from writing 350, 400 stories a year when I covered UNC to maybe 40 or 50 something nowadays. And so certainly that lends itself to doing more high quality work, and you actually get to take a breath every now and then. I know that's a luxury that most folks don't have, but I'm thankful and grateful that I do.
Right. Sounds like some exciting things in the future. We'll definitely keep an eye out for those. My last question is just about this award. So as someone who's, spent pretty much your entire career in the business and sort of perfecting your craft, what does it mean to have your work recognized with a State Sportswriter of the Year award, especially one that's, recognized by your peers?
Yeah, it means a ton. And, I was surprised when Dave called me and informed me of it, just because, I'm my own toughest critic. And, I think that's not really unique to me. I think a lot of folks in this business, especially people who, maybe care more, we care about it all, the reporting side and a lot of aspects of it. But those of us, especially who care a lot about the writing, might look at what we do as never good enough, or I wish I would have done this differently, or you look at like some of the best people in the country and what they're doing, and you're like, man, I'm never going to be as good as such and such person. Or that sometimes I see a story and I'm like, I just never want to write anything again, because that kind of thing. And of course it's a silly thought, but I think everyone deals with that. So it's such an honor that your colleagues recognize you in that way. I probably would have voted for my colleague Luke DeCock, who's our columnist. I think he had a great year. Scott Fowler in Charlotte, certainly deserving. Our beat folks at the NNO, I think all of them were nominated. C.L. Brown and Steve Wiseman, and Brendan Marks at The Athletic is phenomenal. So sometimes I wonder if Dave needs to do a recount on it and make sure that I was actually the guy. But yeah, I mean, it is such a, it's a great honor. Looking at the list of folks who have shared that recognition over the years, it's an amazing list. I mean, Lennox Rawlings back in the day, he was one of my favorite writers. Ed Harden, longtime columnist with the News and Record, has won it a ton of times. And there's a great legacy of sports journalists and writers. And on the broadcasting side, certainly Stan is amazing. So to be in his company is quite the honor. And on that side too, just a great legacy of folks. So to join that tradition and be a part of that is really special, especially in a state that really means a lot to me.
Certainly. Congratulations again, Andrew. Thank you for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Absolutely.